On the podcast today, we will dissect chapter 15 of the Tao Te Ching, which makes up the 15th episode of the 81 meditations on the Tao Te Ching. And if you're new to the channel, then you can head over to the playlist of the 81 meditations of the Tao Te Ching to watch all previous episodes. And in this series, we will dissect two translations. We have the Jia Fu Feng and Jane English translation, which Guyang will read, and I have the Derek Lin translation. So without further ado.
The ancients were subtle, mysterious, profound, responsive. The depth of their knowledge is unfathomable. Because it is unfathomable, all we can do is describe their appearance. Watchful, as though crossing a winter stream. Alert, like people aware of danger. Courteous, like visiting guests. Yielding, like ice about to melt. Simple, like uncarved blocks of wood. Hollow, like caves. Opaque, like muddy pools. Who can wait quietly until the mud settles? Who can remain still until the moment of action? Observers of the Tao do not seek fulfillment. Not seeking fulfillment, they are not swayed by desire for change.
Okay, and Derek's translation says, the Tao masters of antiquity, subtle wonders through mystery, depths that cannot be discerned, because one cannot discern them. Therefore, one is forced to describe the appearance. Hesitant, like crossing a wintry river. Cautious, like fearing four neighbors. Solemn, like a guest. Loose, like ice about to melt. Genuine, like plain wood. Open, like a valley. Opaque, like muddy water. Who can be muddled yet desist in stillness, gradually become clear? Who can be serene yet persist in motion, gradually come alive? One who holds this Tao does not wish to be overfilled, because one is not overfilled. Therefore, one can preserve and not create anew. This chapter is specifically about the characteristics of a Taoist sage.
Yes, that's what it's trying to explain, right? Because here it says the depth of their knowledge is unfathomable, so that all we can do is to describe their appearance.
Yes.
So basically, it's talking about appearance. Here it says appearance, but more so like a characteristics of masters.
Yes.
Yeah.
And how we should emulate them. Like this chapter is about how we, in some sense, should emulate the sages. Or, you don't want to go out and start copying them, but it's what is kind of required, because we see kind of a strategy here about remaining open, being genuine, being loose and flexible.
Yes.
And not being inflexible and dogmatic.
Yes.
It's about remaining as open as the valley.
Yes. Well, it's actually one of the most important teaching in Tao Te Ching and Taoism in general. I think it's once you understand the characteristics of Taoist sages, then we get to know how we should change ourselves.
Yep.
To almost like to become one of them.
Yeah. And just to clear up, when in both translations, Derek says the Tao masters of antiquity, Jia Fu Feng and Jane English talk about the ancient masters. We need to, for us in the modern day, obviously we can look at Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi as the ancient masters and the Taoist sages, but according to Lao Tzu, when he wrote the Tao Te Ching back 2,500 years ago, he was not speaking about himself, or Zhuangzi was not even born yet, and he did not know who the Buddha was, for example, or Vyasa.
Shankara.
Well, Shankara came way later too, so he's not speaking about these masters. He's speaking specifically about who was ancient to him. So who was ancient to him was Huangdi, was the Yellow Emperor, and Fuxi, who was the original author of the I Ching. And particularly with the Yellow Emperor, a lot of people think of the Yellow Emperor as a mythological figure, and we could say that because you're going back further and further.
Long time ago.
Yeah, it's hypothesized that if Huangdi existed, he was born 2700
BCE.
2711 BCE, and he lived until around 2598 BCE, which makes him around 113 years old.
Okay.
So, but that's all people don't really know for sure, and that's why a lot of people think that Huangdi was, a mythological figure and not real. But what we have to consider, and if we look at it from Lao Tzu's perspective, we don't just turn up in the Shah dynasty, the first dynasty in China, all civilized and with knowledge out of the caves. Like, there was a long gradual process, and there were societies and Taoist communities in the Neolithic period where a lot of people don't consider, right? They just think that, Fuxi and the Yellow Emperor were the kind of these mythical ruler sages, but there's an argument there that they were actually real people.
Of course. I think the only problem around that is because back in that long time ago, the knowledge was passed on by verbally.
Yeah.
It was completely relied on memorizing their teachings and reciting whatever they wrote and scriptures and things like that, because they didn't want to risk writing them down just in case if someone add things that they're not supposed to be in this and that. I think that's why there is not much written record.
Well, they didn't have a printing press, right?
Well, yes.
So, they wrote on bones and...
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Around the time when actually paper was invented, right?
Yeah.
And so there is other things around it. The reason why these people remained as like a mythical people, for us, and even for Lao Tzu as well, somewhat, when he was alive.
Of course. There is the story of the three sovereigns, right? So you have Fuxi, you have Shen Nong, which is the divine farmer, and then you have the Yellow Emperor. So they were all before the Shah dynasty, and when you see the literature now, they all think about them mythologically.
Yes.
But Shen Nong, for example, you translate it as divine farmer or divine husband or something along those lines. But nevertheless, there were obviously masters before Lao Tzu that they may have been mythologized.
Yes.
That's like any great spiritual teacher, right?
That kind of gives us this kind of opens up this huge space in the head, I think, because we have a mythologized story about Buddha and Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, all these ancients. We call it today, but when they were alive, they themselves had those ancients from their time. Of course. So opens up whoa, okay, it's a very, very long history we're talking about here.
Oh, exactly. Well, if you look at it, if Lao Tzu was a real figure and he did exist around 600 to 500 BCE, 2700 BCE is as long as us
how we
are to Lao Tzu, you see. So we look at it from our distance and go, it's not too far down the track. It's like, no, it's still thousands of years between, the
very long time
between when Huangdi was hypothesized to live as opposed to Lao Tzu. So, but that's just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into it, but in saying that, we can think of the ancient Taoist sages and the masters as Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. So that's kind of the end point there. And so, as we were talking about, this chapter is more so about how to emulate the sage and about how the sage themselves, and we read about this a lot in Taoism, they don't really advertise their spirituality. They're genuine.
No.
They're just like an ordinary person.
Yes.
This is why a lot of times on some of my videos, people get confused because I say being ordinary is extraordinary.
Yes.
So the real spirituality is being really ordinary, like Lin Qi,
Yes.
Move your bowels, go to sleep. It's not difficult, but the difficulty is in a complex society is to live a simple life. And that's what this chapter is kind of alluding to, right? Like there's since the dawn of agrarian cultures, there's always been complex thought structures, but there's always been a natural thought structure that we are still always connected to, but then we have this socialization program that we downregulate and we download within our system, and we begin to operate from that system. But the Taoist sage is beyond all conventional thinking.
Yes.
Because natural thought is not in sync with socialization.
Again, that's why people misunderstand some qualities about the Taoist sages, again, because they seem somewhat indecisive, confused, very, like, in that translation says hesitant. So it's somewhat, these qualities are not very embraced by modern society, like the socialization world, the socialized world. So doesn't take it as a valuable thing. But because they are hesitant, very watchful, courteous, and simple, hollow, opaque, this means that these sages follow Taoism, the way of nature.
Tao,
The way of nature doesn't separate things clearly, this or that. They kind of always seek balance and middle way. From that perspective, it's hard to make a distinction, clear distinction between what's right or wrong, what's left and right, or high and low, and this sort of concept. This kind of quality came to our mind with this artificial socialization.
Well, Taoism represents best the Eastern cognitive style of holism, right? So not having a category and object mindset as opposed to Western thought, which is based on individualism, which is based on categories and objects. So there must always be left and right, there must always be right and wrong, and so forth and so on. But Taoism, as we know and we've explained a lot through this series, is that in reality there is no right and wrong, good and bad, because that's all a subjective viewpoint, again based on individualism. Though there are things naturally that we would say are negative, obviously, like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. I'm not, promoting people to go out and be violent and so forth and so on. We know that that's wrong. We don't need to be told, and we don't need a system and rules and regulations to explain to us that that's wrong.
Yes.
So Taoism is, as I said, represents that holistic mindset where we see everything in its totality, in its whole nature, as Jiddu Krishnamurti would say, as opposed to filtering it through our subjective experience, through the me and the I and the mind, and filtering it through that. But we're looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. We're not really seeing the world as it truly is. And that mindset, particularly in the modern day, is very frightening. And I get a lot of my videos, especially with these sorts of, about Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, or even Ramana Maharshi, and these sorts of videos, where people say, oh yeah, it was something reasonable for them in that time, but it's not reasonable anymore. And that's where it's really sad, right? Because they've fallen into the hypnosis, as you was mentioning, with this Western aggressive go-getter mentality, and they don't have a very careful nature anymore. Like you mentioned with hesitant, what they're saying with hesitant, like what Derek's saying, hesitant like crossing a wintry river, is being very careful with life. You know what I mean? Not going out and just barging doors down as a go-getter or as an entrepreneur. And, but that's the modern mindset, right? Which is a very Western European mindset. And from North America, that's gone everywhere around the world. And a lot of people are falling in line with that, even in the East, as you know, like in Korea. It's been, that sort of mindset has been kind of infecting the hearts and minds of people for half a century.
Yes.
And the thing is, and even if you look at it from Richard Nisbet's work on the geography of thought, between the two different cognitive styles of the East and the West, is it's the Eastern cognitive style is the natural style, because everything is holistic,
It's a war between our innate intuition versus rational mind. But since the birth of Immanuel Kant, for instance, so we're going back like 1700, So he really pursued the idea of there is a one absolute law that we need to follow. So he understood our intuitive mind as well, but some reason he had this strong urge to find out there must be some sort of absolute value or law that we should be following, which we all should follow, like everybody basically. And that is rationality in his study.
Yeah, for sure.
Again, we know how important to be rational at times, but what I think it's a lot to do with around the time that he lived as well. It must be much more smaller society, not as complex and complicated as today. So he didn't maybe see the importance of intuitive mind, although he did credit somewhat the intuition. But again, over time, for some reason, since Immanuel Kant and all the other philosophers who thought alike over in Western Europe kept pursuing that idea until even nowadays in academic field, a lot of people follow that way of thinking. But I think that's very outdated way of thinking. And there are quite good number of scholars contemporary now coming out and counter-arguing that theory, which is very plausible, and there is lots of evidence why they make so much sense to give, we should give so much more importance and attention to how important innate intuitive mind is, because since society had become so complex and there are so much more people, so many more population out there, so society became much more complex and diverse, and there's so much different culture going on, and there's new cultures being created in a very short time, and this and that. So it's actually, there doesn't seem like much room to use our rational mind over this social dynamic to understand what's going on. It's almost we need to embrace our intuitive sense a little bit more to feel it out, to be able to see actually bigger picture. Because innate intuition allows us to see the bigger picture. And again, comes back to why following Taoism is actually so much more important. It's completely natural to all of us, and it's just to become a go-getter is completely counterintuitive to everybody. That's why when we trying to do something and become aggressive and plan everything and you try to be smart and clever at things, but then there's all the other side, which is we get very stressful, become competitive, we become jealous, and these qualities which is counter to human values occur.
Often the rational person too gains too many beliefs and opinions because they are rational, right? So that they dissect reality according to their intellect and their rational perspective, which again is still subjective in the end of the day. It's still a subjective viewpoint. But Taoism, this is a problem with the Enlightenment period in Europe, which Kant is part of, is that the concept that the mind is something separate from the body. So you have this rational being controlling this completely irrational body. Now, Taoism, as a holistic philosophy, there is no separation between mind and body. It's not mind-body dualism, as the West believe. It's mind-body holism.
Yes.
And we know this intuitively, but see, the rational perspective gets in the way. You can take a pill, for example, and you're taking that physiologically, right? Maybe for a psychological problem, and it has an effect. There's direct evidence of mind-body holism.
100%.
But we think of it in the sense that because we identify with this sense of ego, this sense of agency, and we think we are this rational being controlling this irrational body.
Yes.
We often have this, Edward Slingerland said this phrase once about mentioning about how when we wake up in the morning, we say, I had to drag myself out of bed in the morning. And he would say, who is the I that has to drag anyone? Because there is only this.
Yes.
So, but unconsciously we have this perspective of there's this rational being controlling this irrational body, which is a complete illusion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Taoism is saying. And they're saying embrace actually mind-body holism. And it's not to say that the rational perspective is an incorrect cognition. It's not.
Yeah.
What we're saying is that when you overemploy rationality,
Yes.
that's when all problems occur. Because if we look at it from a mind-body holistic system, it means our cognition is embodied. It's not disembodied. You see, so the rational movement made people believe, and still are making people believe, that cognition isn't disembodied from this, but it's actually embodied. It's an embodied cognition. That's what martial arts and everything is about. The spiritual martial arts as well, such as Tai Chi Chuan,
Yes.
are about reconnecting our circuits, so to speak, and reconnecting with the embodied cognition. And in the world today, because we've gone head-on into education, we've gone head-on into rational thinking, this is the reason why there's so much confusion in the world, because we're dissociated with our intuitive faculties.
Yes.
And we don't realize, actually, that over 90% of our life is controlled by the intuition.
Yes.
The hot cognition is controlling the show. We have a very small slither of control with the cold cognition, which is related to the rationality, but it's such a small slither of control.
Yes.
But we think that we can control when we wake up in the morning, when we eat our meals, when we go to school. We think we actually are running the show, but there's so many variables that can happen within a day.
Yes.
Right.
This book that I'm reading by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind, he actually puts that analogy to like an elephant and a person who sits on top of elephant. So obviously person to elephant is like so tiny. So that person being a rational mind, and the elephant is this huge, big, gigantic animal, that being our intuitive mind.
Exactly.
So that's a really good way to put it.
It is. And that goes to show that we're not saying also that intuition is like a saintly cognition too. Like we do have intuitive errors. We do have things within our character that actually rationality helps through training and so forth and so on. This is what meditation is about, right? You're trying to observe your nature, so to speak. Your nature is actually the intuitive hot cognition. And so you're trying to observe that, in some sense, with your rational mind.
Yes.
But it's such a large aspect of your life, as you said, with the elephant. And you have this little tiny piece of attention that can try and pay attention to all of those hot processes within our mind.
Yes. So I think the reason why the mind-body dualism is so widespread around the world with the modern people is because we are so somewhat accustomed to just keep looking out. Obviously, like material world and this and that. But mind-body holism is just all about coming back to ourselves and almost like observing how our mind works and how also body functions along with the mind, right? It's all about observing how things already are instead of finding some other, concepts and facts and try to fill that into nature.
Yep.
So it's all about kind of going all the way around 180 degrees, so putting things the other way around.
Yes.
So instead of putting other matter outside, try to fit ourselves to fit in that concept. Instead of doing that, we're trying to observing ourselves and nature to see how things actually work and function and how they're mutually interdependent, basically interacting with each other.
Exactly. Well, we are constantly downloading a system, right? Like even at Lao Tzu's time, it was Confucianism. People were downloading the social program of Confucianism. But we need to do the 180 degrees, go back to nature, which can be difficult for a lot of people because we're so trained to be aggressive. We're so trained to compete,
Yes.
actually. We're so trained to compete. And that's why when a Taoist sage pops up, they're always so odd And people are confused by their way of living, right? And that's why actually the Tao Te Ching was written, because the guard at the Western Gate said to Lao Tzu, like, come on, please, can you just leave something behind for me? Like, because I'm stuck here at the Western Gate. This is my life, you know.
Give me something.
Give me something, you know. I'm grinding an axe here. So if we look at Taoism as opposed to Confucianism, and as opposed to even modern social systems, is Taoism is not a cultivation method, you see. It's not a self-cultivation method, where Confucianism is a self-cultivation method.
Yes.
You need to apply yourself and mold yourself to these certain principles, rules, and regulations, where if we look through the whole Tao Te Ching and we look through the whole Zhuangzi, both Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi are completely making fun of applying yourself to an external system of rules and regulations, because it's not nature. It comes from a person's mind, this person being Confucius, who thinks they know best for everyone else. But Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi would just say, Confucius just needs to chill. He just needs to chill, man, and just
let people just be themselves.
Let people be themselves. Mind your own business. And see, this is, in the modern day especially, no one is minding their own business. Everybody's telling each other what to do. And this is very unnatural. First, you don't trust other people. And you think your personal subjective experience is best for everyone else. Where Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi are saying that's a type of hypnosis, and almost a type of, you know, a delusion that people have.
It's a very dangerous idea, I think.
Of course.
If you were to apply in political way,
Oh, God.
you can create some monster-like leadership, right? Like really, like almost like a tyranny, dictatorship, and this sort of people who are in a position of power when it's applied to politics.
That's what a politician is, right? The politician is seeking control. They want control. Yeah. And as we know in the world today, unfortunately, they have all the control, especially in this particular situation. But that's the difference, right, between the Taoist approach to a society and a external philosophy of how society should be, which is what any system actually is. Even if we look at democracy, communism, and so forth and so on, they still are external systems. We could say some are better than the other, for sure. But they still are external systems, and they still are moving away from nature as opposed to returning to the uncarved block.
Yes.
So everyone's taken on the carving and polishing metaphor of Confucius as opposed to the uncarved block. And that's where it becomes weird, right? Like when you are perfectly fine with the situation, when people are asking you for a certain emotion to the situation, but you are completely impartial, they sometimes distance themselves from you because they think, oh, she's a wild one.
And they find it even more strange if I was to be okay with it, completely fine just being like that, like in the kind of in the middle way, like not choosing this or that, like completely okay with it. And they find that that's a bit more strange. Like, why is that person not choosing anything? Like, she must have some sort of idea. She must have, some sort of decision. Like,
You must have an opinion, right?
Yeah.
That's what they think, that you must have an opinion. And when you're completely impartial and you don't have an opinion because you personally know it's just your subjective opinion, and why would it even matter in the grand scheme of things? Like everyone, especially on social media these days, they'll ask someone, what's your opinion of this? And it's like, well, I don't have an opinion of it. I don't know enough about it. So it would be very irresponsible of me to actually make a statement about that. I would need to know a lot of the moving parts to make a statement. But then everyone's haphazardly saying, they're on trolling and they're spraying vile everywhere about things that they don't really know. And that's a sign of a lack of intelligence, as opposed to, as it's saying in this chapter of the Tao Te Ching, being very cautious and careful and not trying to stir the world up with your own subjective viewpoint and agenda. Where the sage, as Richard Wilhelm says in the commentary of the I Ching, is that though we think the sage is doing nothing on the mountain, they're creating incomparable values for the future. But we don't see it that way, because they're just up on the mountain meditating, they're in samadhi, and everyone else is down grinding an axe.
Yes.
But they've chose the natural path.
Yes.
to distance themselves, and that's representation too. Like they could still be living in society, but distance themselves from this state of hypnosis.
Yes, of course.
But the moral of the story is that you need to be as careful and calm as a sage when you move through life, as opposed to blasting your way through life, which only destroys relationships. People gain a bad opinion of you. Oh, he's hard work, that one, and so that's what it's like, right?
Yeah, in that point of view, we can easily say that these Taoist masters and sages were completely overcame that qualities in socialized world,
Yeah.
right? They kind of seeing us from way up in the mountain somewhere in a cave and having a bit of a laugh, basically, right?
Yeah,
Like
of course.
he doesn't discredit what people are doing, but he also sees what that can turn out to be.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, that's
so
right.
That, he sees the much bigger picture. There's a whole picture.
Yeah.
So that he chose to follow the natural way, which required to be overcome all these social values.
Yeah.
What's meant to be done.
Yeah. Well, part of the system, the social system, it's just part and parcel. People say, why are people dogmatic? Why are people fundamentalists? It's part of the system, right? You gain an opinion, a subjective opinion. You believe in that. You build your own little tribe, and you'll defend it to the end of days. Where the sage is never dogmatic. They're always open. They're always flexible.
Yes.
Because they haven't bought into any agenda. They haven't bought into this or that. And so they move through life efficaciously without incurring any harm on themselves or others. Whereas when you're a dogmatic person and you believe in all of these things that you've learned from society, you do incur harm on yourself and you do incur harm on others. Not physically a lot of the times, but it can be psychologically.
Yes.
You can be especially harming yourself by being an overly dogmatic person.
Yes.
Which in turn harms a lot of other people. And so we have to, in some sense, as we learn from this chapter, is be loose and relaxed and learn to have a sense of humor about things. Humor is a big part of the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. And we live in a world now with this overly political correctness, which is on the brink of insanity,
Yes.
which lacks a sense of humor. So when someone makes fun of how stupid it is, they get criticized or cancelled in air quotes, which is a completely nonsensical statement, but that's what happens, right? So it's best not to fall into accord with that sort of political correct mindset that's kind of infecting the hearts and minds of people in a day, and regaining your sanity through humor and being relaxed and speaking your mind in a very pure way, like from your intuitive sense, right? Like, and being genuine.
Yes.
Genuineness is a big thing in the world these days that is criticized. You need to curate yourself. You need to be very
Carved block.
You have to be the fully carved block, right? If you speak your mind and you make a crack or something funny about something, people will go, "Oh, I mean, Guy Young's she's a bit out of control, a bit raw, isn't she?"
Yeah. Sometimes people take sarcastic humor too personally for some reason.
Yeah.
You gotta really think twice before you make a joke about something sometimes.
Yeah, but that's what's wrong with society. See, you have to think twice before being genuine. Isn't that what's wrong with society? And that is a perfect strategy, like what you said, because if you're with people who are overly sensitive because of the political correct pathogen that's infected the hearts and minds of people, then it makes you second guess about being genuine. And so then you find only those with their sanity that you be genuine with them. That's exactly what's wrong with society, right? Where we used to be all genuine a lot of the time because we didn't have a lot of this nuance to society. Everything was down to earth, which is what a sage is, right? A sage is down to earth.
Yes.
Where we create a society that's not down to earth, it's a bit floaty, and then even our spirituality becomes floaty.
Yes.
Right? So you see this within New Age spirituality, where they turn Eastern spirituality into something that it's not. It's an over-sensationalized version of spirituality. And that, like I mentioned earlier, when I say to them, in being ordinary is extraordinary, they can't understand that because they want to go around telling everyone that they're an enlightened being. Obviously, you're never an enlightened being when you tell someone you're an enlightened being, but they want to do that. Just read some of my comments, right? A lot of people will say, I'm an enlightened being and this and that. I'm like, what? Like, that's a minority, obviously. But that's a dead sign that you're not an enlightened being, because only the ego would make that statement. And so the Taoist sage embodies a down-to-earthness that I think is a bit too radical for people in the modern day.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to reevaluate the quality of nature here.
Yeah.
I think the reason why people look down at the people who are hesitant, more cautious, and this and that is because people undermining these natural qualities, I think.
Yep.
And that is a huge, huge mistake. That's why we are here in this world right now, right? Full of confusion and argument after argument, right? And disagreement after disagreement, that they don't know how to communicate with each other, basically. Yeah, so again, the beauty of this chapter is showing that the Taoist master always followed the nature, and he represents the beauty of nature. And in the end, you internalize way of nature. So literally, we are nature, but also we become natural in psychological sense as well. We are embracing and absorbed to this quality of nature. So again, uncarved blocks of wood is always we talked about a lot in this series, and yeah, which is again not decorated, innocent, honest, and inseparable. It's holistic. It's a whole thing. Again, that is some people think maybe dull, but that's how modern conceptual way you can see it that way. But that means represents actual authenticity, I think, for me, and genuineness as well. Yeah. Again, like opaque, like muddy water. Yeah, you try not to be righteous.
Yeah, of course.
See things as they are, and you have patience to let just muddy water settles itself without you interfering in it, right?
Exactly.
Can you imagine you try to settle muddy water down, like artificially? How do you do it?
It just makes it more muddy too.
Well, exactly. It's more difficult. You gotta put more effort, and is it gonna work? No, you make it worse. So best way is just sit and wait.
Yeah,
right.
100%. You got to be as calm as a lion waiting for a gazelle on the savannah, just waiting all day. But even with more patience.
Yes.
And so we live in a world where patience is not a virtue anymore.
100%.
We how do we settle the muddy water? Well, I got a sheet of iron here. Let's try and push it down and see if it goes to the ground. And it's like, no, that's going to make it worse.
Yes.
So you need to cultivate that genuineness and that, like you said, that authenticity, right? That authenticity. Something that's really missing from the world is that sense of authenticity.
Yes, 100%.
And the sage doesn't need to jazz it up, as you were mentioning, like the uncarved block. They don't need accessories. They don't need to wear a top hat like in Confucianism to show like I'm a gentleman. Look, I'm a junza. They don't need any of these accessories to showcase their spirituality. They are not that insecure. They don't need to mark their face. They don't need to do anything like this. They are not that insecure. They can just live as they were born.
Yes.
And move on with it. It's like we have a Korean friend in South Korea, and his master, Taoist master, is just like a farmer. He's just a genuine, ordinary guy.
Yes.
He doesn't have a temple or a monastery. He's just a guy that people know has got the wisdom.
Yes.
So they visit him and every now and again, but he's just the average Joe. Because he's embodied unintentionally this perspective. And it's a real funny thing, because what I've noticed in the years that I've been doing this is that a lot of the most genuine masters don't jazz it up. They just are the ordinary person.
Yes.
And they don't need, to dress a certain way and so forth and so on. There's this ordinariness, like I mentioned with Lin Chi and Zen, that really draws people into them. It has an energy about it that draws people in. And we see that with a lot of masters, right? Like Ramana Maharshi was just wearing a cloth. So you don't get any more basic than that. But people were drawn to him.
And again, that tells me like being genuine and authentic is, I couldn't explain why, but it's just the right values. It's just the right thing to embrace as a human being, as an individual. Because like you said, somewhat people get naturally attracted to that sort of individual at the end of the day, right? So there's something right about those qualities.
Exactly. Well, the Tao gravitates to the simple. That's like the energy moves to where there's not a lot of crap. That's just the way the Tao is.
Right.
And that's why in the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, they're constantly trying to reinforce in people's mind to simplify your life, to return to nature, not nature in the physical sense, return to your nature, which is very simple, where you don't need this and that. All you do is you need the simple things. So if you live a life with moderation and you're a very down-to-earth person that someone can rely on, like if for people they might envision their grandmother maybe, like it was, a lot of our grandmothers were very down-to-earth women and, they didn't beat around the bush, you know what I mean? So they would tell you what is wrong and what is right, but from a very wise perspective, you could say. Not all grandmothers, but, most, I would say. So you have that quality,
yes,
but the Tao moves towards that. And so a lot of people who have a lot of things in their life, like a lot of, even possessions, physical possessions, they say, why don't I have a lot of luck or fortune?
Yes.
And I'm not saying that the Tao actually favors anyone. It's just as nature is. The river of the Tao moves to where the natural course of life is. So if you're a person who's just living a very simple life, you are in tune with the natural course of life because you haven't built an empire around you.
You don't build too much of a resistance to the world, right?
No.
So you let natural energy just come to you and let it flow through you, kind of thing, isn't it? That's why, again, being authentic and genuine is actually easiest thing to do. And that is completely natural to all of us. So that is to say, is the most Taoist way so that Tao can move through that path.
Exactly. Your identity and your beliefs and all of these complex elements of socialization that you have in your mind is like a dam for the river. So the river's still the Tao is still trying to move through you, but you've got all of these things, these blockages, and then you can't be genuine and authentic because you're operating from a socialization process that you've inculcated within your mind, that you've absorbed from the external world. And that's why you have to start to turn your attention within to come into harmony with the energy that's moving through all of us. And the way to do that is to simplify your life, live a life of moderation. You don't need all of this money. You don't need all of these possessions to...
Sometimes it is, I can understand, it is very difficult to do because that sort of reaction, for instance, like trying to please other people and worry about other people's perception about you and things like that, is somewhat, we have conditioned since very young age, so it's almost so hot. Like it's almost became unconscious response. I think that's why it's very difficult, but I think, again, like not easy, but the best way thing to do is when you do react in certain way that you didn't intend to, but that is to was to kind of show it as a certain way to other people, then you gotta quickly aware of that, I think, your own behavior, and just to be aware of that and not to repeat that again. So that's sort of just a kind of practice to reminding yourself not to be that way, like not to react inauthentically. Yeah,
of course. And that's where you need to deprogram yourself, right? So you can react authentically, you know. That's the thing, right? So like it gets towards in the end of the chapter where it says not seeking fulfillment, they are not swayed by desire for change. And observers of the Tao do not seek fulfillment. And this is more related to overfilling your cup, right? So as we were mentioning, you're overfilling it. In this sense, once you start to accumulate too much knowledge and too status, and when you have too many desires and this and that, that leads into arrogance. So arrogance, you're starting to overflow. Your cup is overflowing,
Yes.
and you think you're the man. But as we know, with an overflowing cup, it spills everywhere and causes a lot of destruction. And so that's what a lot of us are doing. We're overfilling our mind cup, and we're going around with arrogance, telling people how to be, how the world should be. I mean, it's pretty arrogant, right, from a subjective viewpoint. So our job then is to reduce everything, right, to regain our sanity. So if we're fidgety, you need to reduce being fidgety to regain composure. If you're excessive, you need to reduce excessiveness to come back to simplicity. There's a lot of things, right? You need to reduce your ego to come back to humility. There's a lot of things that we need to consider.
Yes. Again, simplicity has always been a very important practice to follow Taoist way, and which only going to make everyone happier.
Yes,
obviously,
that's right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So again, simplify everything, even like what you eat, what you drink. That's very basic, but that can do huge benefit to everybody, right? Like just change your taste bud and just have a less sugar, less chocolate, which less coffee, which only triggers more the fidgeting, the anxiety, which is not very good.
No, it's not very good. And what you're talking about really is with simplicity and with moderation, is we are trying to preserve the Tao in our life. We're trying to preserve it instead of it not using us at all, or we're just spending our energy on frivolous things that are meaningless, right? So when you are down to earth and you're simple, you preserve it. So this is why you need to hold on to the real basic fundamentals of life, and actually embrace that simplicity. It's enjoyable to sit and just eat a meal with someone without having Netflix on.
No.
Right?
Yep.
It is really enjoyable.
Yes.
People have lost contact with that because they're always watching TV and so forth. But reduce all of that. And this is where, Derek says at the end, therefore, one can preserve and not create anew. He's not talking really about creativity here. Rather, he's talking about, drawing attention to oneself by doing unusual things. So, a lot of people, as I mentioned in the New Age, right? People are trying to do unusual things to draw attention to themselves, where the sage is so comfortable and secure within themselves because they're down to earth. They don't need that. They don't need attention. If no one knows them, they could give two hoots, right? They're all good. They got their feet up. They got their straw in their mouth, sipping a green tea.
Happy.
Life is good. And so that's how you preserve the Tao. You live that simple life. And the Taoist master never creates a scene and stays away from controversy.
Yes.
Always. And that's something that we can learn, right? Because we live in the age of controversy because of social media, where everyone's putting out the most controversial article or this and that to try and garner a lot of attention. The Taoist sage is like, nah, no need.
Yeah, let's stop feeding our crazy mind. Stop feeding this, automatic mind, and just put the stop to it and get back to simple life and reduced, humble life.
Exactly. It's not hard, like you said.
Yeah.
It's the easiest thing actually to do.
Yeah, again, that is a preserving the Tao, and also that is you live Tao, right? You live that.
You become a living embodiment of the Tao.
Well, yes.
And that's our role as a human being, right?
Exactly.
And we were a living embodiment of the Tao before the socialization process was brought in. We've just become confused as the socialization process has gone on for millennia.
Yes.
And has become more complex, taking us further away from our nature.
Right.
And so the Tao Te Ching brings us back to our nature.
Very good.
So guys, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you guys next time.